the chapter included on aging women in horror films on which this talk is based. They also have chapters in edited collections, Priests, Secrets, and Holy Water, All I Ever Learned About Catholicism, I learned from horror films, and Theology and Horror, Explorations of the Dark Religious Imagination, published in 2021, an analysis of the devil and the culture wars and the last temptation of Christ and the passion of the Christ in the devil and the cultural wars, demonizing controversy in the last temptation of Christ and the passion of the Christ in the Bible on screen in the new millennium, published in 2020. Please welcome Dr. Cage from the
Thank you, Brandy, for that. For anybody who wants I always do printed copies of my talks for accessibility in case anybody wants to follow along. So those are up front. And I want to thank Professor McLeese for the introduction. And I want to thank Dr. Reed for allowing me to have this talk. Although he did tell me that it was just because he's always wanted to do a book tape. So, but I'll take it any way I can. It's a win-win for everybody. So this is a talk about horror films. So I am going to warn you, there are graphic images in the presentation. That's the only warning you get. As Professor McLeese said, my scholarship focuses on what horrifies us and why. So let's start by talking about what we find horrifying. And what we don't, and what we'll watch for entertainment, and what we'll refuse to acknowledge is going on in the world. You watch the bag that man is carrying contains the only remains he was able to find of his son. And since we're talking about things we find entertaining, this is a Google search for horror films that include rape. And here is an alphabetical list just of American horror films that have rape in them. Because apparently that is entertaining. Despite the fact that this recently happened in the news where during the genocide in Sudan, over 130 women died by suicide to avoid being raped as part of the genocide. We think the razor box in Saw 2 is entertainment, but we refuse to face the colonial horrors from the Congo. Horror studies applies a variety of theoretical lenses, including psychoanalysis, new historicism, feminist theory, queer theory, monster theory, and Marxist theory. And if you don't know what any of those are, you should be taking my literary criticism class next spring. Horror is always a reflection of its historical and cultural moment, whether that's seen in the rise of vampire tales during tuberculosis outbreaks, haunted house stories as people worry about threats to domestic spaces in the 70s, or slashers as Western society sees a threat in women's increasing roles outside the house. Before we get into the analysis, let's start with what you know. Who can tell me what a final girl is? And notice it's in quote, that's important later. Professor McLeese? Correct. It's a term actually created by Carol Clover, who was a medievalist, by the way, before she became a horror scholar. And she terms it in her chapter, Her Body, Himself, in her book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film. in 1992. Remember that chapter title, it becomes important later. She described a final girl as the female victim hero, the one who survived. She's typically in her teens. She perceives the full extent of the horror and her own peril. She is chased, cornered, wounded. We see her scream, stagger, fall, rise, and scream again. She is abject horror personified. She is the Girl Scout, the bookworm, the mechanic. She is not sexually active. She is not available. She is watchful to the point of paranoia, and she is intelligent and resourceful in a pinch. She is boyish, and just as the killer is not fully masculine, she is not fully feminine. Sally Hardesty in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1974 is a final girl. Laurie Strode in the 1978 Halloween makes the term famous, who Clover uses for her case study. In Friday the 13th, we have Alice Hardy, Ginny Field, and Chris Higgins. A Nightmare on Elm Street has Nancy Thompson. Now, let's pause and relook at these final girls. Traumatized in the back of a truck, literally not in control of where she is going, holding on for dear life. Curled up crying in a closet. Catatonic. Trapped and screaming. As someone who works in horror studies, all of this was familiar to me. And in 2019, I saw a call for papers focused on nostalgia, and I had one simple question. Why do we feel nostalgia for horror and slasher films? What does it say that we long for or feel sentimental about films that at their core torture and exploit women? My friend Wickham and I put together an edited collection that attempted to answer this question, and as the title indicates, we divided the chapters into 3 parts. The first part was nostalgia for the past, as we see in things like Stranger Things, for old technologies and movie spaces and experiences like 3D in My Bloody Valentine and Piranha 3D. Trust me, Piranha 3D is a real winner. How documentaries and fans engage with Friday the 13th paratext. The second part about revisionism talked about how movies attempt to correct or fill in or revise things that were wrong in the original, like looking at requels, directors beefing in the Halloween franchise, toxic masculinity in a post 9/11 world, and Southern racial necropolitics in Angel Heart and Skeleton Key. My chapter is part of the last section on trauma, along with chapters on the remake of Poltergeist as a reflection of the housing crisis and rereading movies in a post-Me Too world. So my talk is based on my chapter, which is Damaged Monsters, Doomed Domesticity, and Defined by Misogyny: What Happens When Final Girls Become Gray Women, in the edited collection. Clover knew that centering the trauma, the torture of women in horror, showed some deeply disturbing issues, as evidenced by this quote. To applaud The Final Girl as a feminist development, as some reviews of Aliens have done with Ripley, is, in light of her figurative meaning, a particularly grotesque expression of wishful thinking. And I've bolded the section that always strikes me. She is simply an agreed upon fiction, and the male viewer's use of her as a vehicle for his own sadomasochistic fantasies, an act of perhaps timeless dishonesty. But her chapter and book came during the 90s, which was a time of girl power and women-driven shows. And so The Final Girl becomes misread as evidence of female empowerment, second-wave feminism, and the troubling aspects are mostly ignored. Yet most often, The Final Girl is portrayed and discussed as a symbol of female empowerment, a feminist icon, a role model for women and female portrayals on film. Despite The Final Girl remaining popular in media and scholarship, our understanding has not substantially changed since Clover's work. The biggest contribution has been the expansion of who gets to be defined and analyzed as the final girl. In What It Feels Like for a Slayer, Buffy Summers and the Paradox of Mothering, Jess Battis explains how the trope has been subverted, while Dr. Robin Means Coleman's work on Black horror and the idea of the, quote, enduring woman, unquote, from horror noir explains the definition, filling in gaps in scholarship, as does Ashley Blackwell's work on Black Final Girls and Christina Leith Mullen's dissertation, My Final Girl, Black Women in American Horror. She also has a comprehensive and stunning companion website called myfinalgirl.com. Kenitra Brooks's 2017 Searching for Sycorax, Black Women's Hauntings of Contemporary Horror expands ideas of Black creators and characters in horror while challenging the lens they get viewed in, as does her work on zombies. Despite this excellent scholarship, massive gaps still exist, both in the movies we need and the scholarship that should follow. Final Girls are a recognizable figure. The tomboy next door, part of a domestic, mostly suburban environment, and always on the outside. They defend their families, their friends, their towns, but once the danger is past, they're returned to their before roles. Despite sequel after sequel, the aging of the character is rarely addressed, reflecting part of a larger issue in Western, specifically US culture. Women are not supposed to age, or rather society and culture has a very specific idea of what is an acceptable way for women to age. Demi Moore is currently 62. She was 59 in this picture. Halle Berry is 58. She was 54 in this picture. Versus most of us that feel like we look more like this. Other than being intrigued about the questionable ethics and morality around the nostalgia, I was interested in the idea of what happens when final girls get older and how they reflect Western and specifically US culture that does not want women to actually age and has no use for women outside of the heavily defined roles of wife, mother, or the old dichotomy of virgin whore. This is specifically relevant now as we see so much of social media trying to sell the trad wife, traditional wife lifestyle. So, what is a gray-haired, perimenopausal, menopausal, more than slightly traumatized woman to do? They become gray women. Gray women are what happen to final girls who are allowed to survive and are granted the privilege to age. While many final girls are granted sequels and are older in those presentations, like Sidney Prescott, Ellen Ripley, Nancy Thompson, there seems to be a line of adulthood that final girls are not allowed to move past. There are two main exceptions to this. Linda Hamilton was 63 when she revisited Sarah Connor in Dark Fate in 2019. And Jamie Lee Curtis was 60 when she played Laurie Strode in the reboot, the reimagining of Halloween that came out in 2018. The older versions of these final girls still retain many of their original character traits, but while there are some additions to these basic traits, the only real difference is that they no longer are the stand-in for male audience members. And it is more common in the sequels for the point of view to begin with them, but end with the third person perspective of the audience, than to end with the final girl's perspective. So think of Sally Hardesty in the back of the truck. We're no longer experiencing those events through her eyes. We see her from the outside. I argue that rather than continue to analyze these characters through the same lens, we need a new term, a new perspective that works to analyze these characters on their own merits and expose the extent that they are limited by misogynistic control and frameworks. While Beyond the scope of this work, I think suggesting gray women as a new term opens the door to analyzing the role of older women characters in horror films, the role they play, and new perspectives for analyzing them. While Lin Shaye as Elise Rainier in the Insidious franchise was 67 in her first film, and Zelda Rubinstein in Poltergeist was 49, both are tangential characters rather than final girls, but I thought they were worth mentioning. So, gray women are defined, just like final girls, by a few key traits. First, gray is the color between black and white, right? Women at this age don't fit in one category or another. They're no longer innocent heroes. They've done horrific things on their own. They may have done it for good reason. They may be justified for survival, but they're still horrific, violent acts on their own. Just because the narrative requires this violence of them does not make them morally right or good. Each of these women have survived against all odds, but they are still presented as outsiders and continue to be presented as more masculine, tomboyish, and deeply traumatized and haunted by their experiences in ways that echo and reverberate throughout their lives as their characters are brought back for sequels. And again and again and again, these women are never allowed to recover, heal, or move on, even when the narrative originally kind of says they can, like Terminator 2, Scream 3, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Final Nightmare, New Nightmare, Halloween H2O 20 years later, and the latest Halloween trilogy all suggest. The age of these women, specifically how their age is reflected in the appearance and performance of these characters, is vital to understanding them and how we frame their trauma narratives. Particularly in the cases of Linda Hamilton and Jamie Lee Curtis, the connection between the character and the actress who plays them is recognizable and iconic. Specifically, Jamie Lee Curtis grows older with Laurie, and while the character's relationship, surroundings, and aesthetics change, Curtis is a stark reminder of the franchise's history. The non-sexual tomboyish figure of the final girl, who is not fully masculine and not fully feminine, has evolved into an asexual postmenopausal 60-year-old woman. And in fact, this is a natural bookend, a mirror portrayal of their original character. These characters also stay in stasis in between movies. Sidney Prescott appears to move forward, graduating high school, going to college, but each stage in life becomes a new setting for old origin stories that inspire new and old serial killers. Sarah Connor is institutionalized and later disappears across the United States of America and then the Mexican border. Ellen Ripley literally sleeps in frozen stasis, then her clones exist in stasis in the lab. Laurie Strode hides, isolating herself away on her property. The stasis also serves to emphasize how these characters can no longer integrate into society, that the events that initially traumatize them make them unfit for normal life. So gray women are defined first by their age appearance, then for the way the narrative focuses on the way they're haunted, and finally for their displaced nature, how they don't fit in their own families, their own lives, their societies, even though many of them are put into new narratives. While older women are not considered the primary audience for these films, it's worth asking what older women fans get out of watching these movies. These characters that we have aged with, and ask why we feel nostalgic for these people, these stories, and return to them again and again. Perhaps it is, as Clover says, we are narratively and cinematically aligned with her, and as women, that's a different connection. So for this, I used Halloween 2018 as a case study to look at these questions. So the first part is they have to be constructed as monsters. These two quotes ran in prep for the movie, and both of them talk about Laurie Strode coming back with PTSD John Carpenter actually says she's somebody who's fucked up. And then Laurie's evolved, but they still tag on to the fact she's a haunted, damaged woman. So gray women are defined by this initial experience, yet there's very little focus on how these experiences affect these women. Sequels and reboots and reimaginings only seem concerned with their experiences as much as it informs the current plot. They serve as a narrative shorthand, not the ways these experiences affected the person themselves. Jamie Lee Curtis's 2018 Laurie Strode is a gray woman because she is primarily defined by what was done to her 40 years ago, the violence and trauma she experienced because of Mike Myers. The traits that allowed her to survive, the fact that she could survive, is actually what constructs her as a damaged monster. This construction is necessary not only to fulfill her purpose in sequels, but to also lay the groundwork for dismissing the character within the framework of the narrative and justifying her treatment. Laurie is constructed as a monster while Michael is shown as someone who deserves understanding. Laurie has changed, but Michael hasn't. Her monstrosity is a result of the traumatic experience of the confrontation, yet she is often blamed for her reaction to this experience. Laurie tells the journalists, Aaron Corey and Dana Haynes, that Mike Myers killed 5 people and he's a human being we need to understand. I'm twice divorced and I'm a basket case. She's presented as unstable, a drunk who is mentally ill. Laurie is described as a monster whose behavior has irrevocably damaged not only herself, but all the people around her. Laurie's lifetime of preparation for her inevitable confrontation with Michael are dismissed by everyone, as is the initial source of her trauma and horrific experiences. Others perceive her actions and thought processes as irrational as well as damaging. Laurie's trauma-informed behaviors are not justified or accepted as either PTSD or a rational and natural response to trauma. Michael is a monster because he killed people 40 years ago, imprisoned in Smith's Grove Psychiatric Hospital ever since. Laurie is a monster because she survived and is imprisoned in a jail of her own making by the decision she makes because of that initial trauma. The movie is extremely specific about portraying them as the same. Michael is institutionalized in a mental hospital. Sheriff Hawkins asked Dr. Sartain if Laurie has, quote, lost her marbles, unquote. Michael Myers is a killer. Laurie Strode intends to become one, praying Michael will escape so she can kill him. This evolution suggests that a consequence of becoming a gray woman is that she is what the killer once was. Narratives frame her actions as necessary, vital to the plot, but it's worth not accepting this at face value and questioning the morals of the gray woman's actions. Monstrous gray women have no redemptive arc. They have one purpose in life, and that purpose requires them to be monsters, even if it's for a worthy cause. Laurie sees her life and decisions as all leading up to that single moment, her chance to kill Michael once and for all. But while movie endings may provide some temporary respite, the audience knows this is a fiction. Boogeymen cannot be killed, especially if they're featured in financially lucrative franchises. Not even last or final in the title prevents studios or creators from resurrecting profitable boogeymen. Why this Halloween iteration was conceived as a trilogy, ending with Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends, there is no guarantee the franchise would not be rebooted or reimagined down the road. Mike Myers and Laurie Strode are presented as counterparts to each other, each monsters in their own way. The idea is introduced by Aaron Corey, the journalist podcaster, when he muses after seeing Michael, can it be that one monster has created another? He goes on to detail how both are monsters and two sides of the same coin. Both exist in isolation, fettered by their own fear and hatred of one another. The film conflates Michael's senseless murder of innocents with Laurie's willingness to kill Michael to protect herself and her family. Both Aaron Corey and Dr. Sartain seem more interested in humanizing Michael. Dr. Sartain acknowledges then dismisses Laurie and any trauma she's experienced. Dr. Sartain implies a symbiotic relationship when he says there are many ways for tragedy and violence to change a victim. They can grow accustomed to always being afraid. In constant fear, they can grow weak, they can grow strong, but there's also the other side, the effect on the victimizer. For Dr. Sartain, Laurie is only of interest for what she can reveal about Michael. The movie supports this presentation as the US one-sheet poster shows. The coloring of their faces connects them, they appear the same. And promotional images use Jamie Lee Curtis as herself posing with Mike Myers in the background. In some ways, this frames Laurie as replacing Michael as the monster. We see this too in the film. And at the top, we have the original Laurie Strode looking out the classroom. At the bottom is the same scene with her granddaughter, Allison. But if we notice, in this case, Laurie has replaced Michael as the threat that is outside. We also see this threat towards the end when Laurie finally traps Michael in the basement. We can see she has taken Michael's place. Much like Sarah Connor, she has spent decades since her first encounter learning new skills for this, but all it has done is frame her as a monster. Even the fact that Laurie lives down a gated road in a house with surveillance cameras and floodlights in an isolated house, all built as a trap for Michael, is shown as proof of her insanity and instability. It's not evidence of her ingenuity. So why gray women are powerful, this powerful is a threat to patriarchal institutions and norms. The only element of gray women that doesn't have sort of a one-by-one comparison to Final Girls is that she is no longer a stand-in for the male teenage audience. The movies they star in sort of depends on a certain nostalgia for these films, but it's not marketed necessarily to older women. The second part is that gray women are unfit for society and they can't have families. So one of the issues with gray women is you have sort of a normal before, and then you have the trauma of the horror film, and then you have the after, right? Which we don't get to see, we just see the effects of. So gray women come out of this stasis and they have to be ready to face their opponents. So Sarah Connor, Laurie Strode are constantly training for that inevitability, but it doesn't leave a lot of time for driving your kids to school and making cookies. In fact, any normalcy is destroyed. For example, Sidney Prescott's boyfriend in Scream ends up being the killer. Her boyfriend in Scream 2 is killed by the killer. She's single in Scream 3 and 4. And instead, we end up with her father who's in and out of the picture. Ripley wakes up in Aliens to learn her daughter Amanda is dead. Newt's cryptopod is destroyed by a xenomorph by the time you get to Alien Resurrection. Kyle Reese, Sarah Connor's love interest, dies in Terminator. In Halloween 2018, we learned that Laurie's daughter, Karen, is removed by Child Services because Laurie is teaching her to shoot and build bombs. Gray women have to be unfit in order to be the monster that is needed. But this is a problem when we place it in society, because if women fail to be successful wives and mothers, then they don't fit into society. Their only purpose then is as gray women in these narratives. So because horror constructs these women as monstrous symbols for the ways they counter patriarchal norms and challenge authority, we can see that this is an extension of the misogyny that's throughout the horror genre. Their actions mark them as perverse. Laurie thinks she has raised Karen to prepare her for the horrors of the world, and yet she is unable to serve the basic functions of wife and mother. This can be seen in Halloween, in this scene, where we have the kitchen, right? The center of the home, the most domestic space, and yet Laurie Strode has turned it into a place to clean her guns and sharpen her weapons. Even her daughter and her granddaughter dismiss her trauma and her current behaviors as not acceptable. At one point, Allison is walking with her friends, and her friend Dave says that Mike Miles only killed 5 people, which is just not that big a deal by today's standards. And when they joke about the events, they minimize Laurie's trauma by saying, well, she escaped. Karen, Lauren's daughter, calls Laurie out for her psychotic rants, that the world is not a dark and horrible place, saying that she just needs help. Allison minimizes Laurie's trauma by saying, yeah, it's pretty much all she talks about. It defines her life. She's been traumatized ever since. And even at one point asks her why she just can't get over it. And yet the last scene in the movie mimics the one we saw from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where now we have apparently the only family that gray women are allowed to have, traumatized and bloody in the back of a truck, escaping a killer. So even though gray women are older, we still see that same trauma and that sort of catatonia and the physical consequences. Part of what comes out of failing as a mother is they offer their children the skills they do have, in that listen to the damaged, traumatized monster of a woman, because essentially it's all they're good for. The quote I kept thinking of over and over again when I was working on this actually comes from this Alien Resurrection. There's a specific scene in Alien Resurrection in which, partway through the movie, the Ripley 8 clone finds the lab where all the failed experiments, all the versions before her, are, including one who is conscious enough to beg Ripley 8 to kill her. So this idea that a woman cannot escape trauma, can never rest, can't recover, can't heal, in addition to the idea that she has no control over her life or her body, is horrifying. And doing this work really laid bare for me the idea of the misogyny of these films. So whether or not we're talking about reading Nightmare on Elm Street as some sort of rape fantasy, or addressing the sexism of calling these people quote unquote final girls. You'll notice that I've put them in quotes the whole time. While the characters Clover analyzed were teenagers, none of the actresses playing them were. Marilyn Burns is 25 when she plays Sally Hardesty in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Jamie Lee Curtis and Heather Langenkamp were both 20 when they played Laurie and Heather in their films. The use of girl also encourages the continued sexist and misogynistic portrayal of women, showing them only as victims with no agency who pay a horrible price. Part of why the language matters is because it doesn't allow them for growth, right? They're defined by this thing that traumatized them as a girl, and that's it. They're stuck there. We also have to address sort of the huge elephant in the room, which is the fact that these characters are under the control of male creators, writers, and directors. Men decide what happens to these women, how and if they get to live, re-victimizing and re-traumatizing them again and again. The male creators, writers, and directors, and the misogynistic requirements of the genre don't allow these characters to grow. They don't grant them any power other than what the narrative gives them. So this is really important because the trauma of the final girl lacks a resolution. The audience ends the movie feeling like the boogeyman's still out there and still a threat, which is why we continue to return to these stories. They partially feel unfinished. But that means the financial aspects of the film industry focus on sequels, remakes, and reboots, and they don't serve the characters or the narrative, but they're protecting revenue streams. Which means women are re-victimized and re-traumatized for money. Because people have decided that these are entertainment and that at the end of the movie, final girls and gray women are put back in their boxes until the next time a sequel comes. They are stripped of all power and agency when they are no longer useful. The structure of the sequels, the revisiting of the pain and the trauma becomes cathartic in the viewing process, but is ultimately unsatisfying. Unfortunately, while looking at gray women as separate from final girls proved interesting analytically, one of the things that was made clear is that gray women are not any more progressive than final girls are. They are still under the control of patriarchal authority. They are still dismissed. They are still considered damaged. They are still constructed as monsters. And so while the term allows us to acknowledge and lay bare a lot of that, it is still ultimately repeating those same sexist stereotypes. And because I always emphasize this with my students, in case it isn't clear, the reason why all this matters, the so what question, is because we live in a world where this exists. And just to pull it all together, think back to what Carol Clover's title of her original chapter was, Her Body, Himself. Alongside with Fuentes, Your Body, My Choice. And again, the quote from Clover. So revisiting this, that the final girl and even the gray woman is an agreed upon fiction. It is the male viewer's use of her as a vehicle for his own sadomasochistic fantasies is disturbing, to say the least. And because I wanted to show you for you, this is the dedication of my book. It's for all my students. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? No? Any questions from anyone on Zoom? Because we have people on Zoom.
I have a question.
Sure.
Thank you. Great job, Dr. Shimabukuro. I like your presentation a lot. In order to change the narrative and change this picture of women that I would say is not just in film.
Right.
We see it in everyday lives, and I think also politically speaking, we just do a similar narrative, right?
Yes.
So, in your opinion, what could be the ways this narrative could be changed? Many issues like ageism, seen especially all women in how they are portrayed in this Western society.
I think there are two answers. The first is men have to stop being sexist and misogynist, and the other one is that women need to write their own stories, and women actors need to wield their power and their privilege to argue against certain portrayals We need more women as script writers. We need more women as directors. We need women of color. We need queer women, right? That they need to be in control of their own narratives, because some of the scholarship I mentioned about the inroads, you know, with Kenitra Brooks and Jess Battis, is that they've shown just what a difference that matters, right? In the same way that having people of color behind the camera matters in how you film and light people of color on film. And so I think it's a matter of people who have the privilege and the leverage using it, and then having more women, you know, both in front of and behind the camera. But the other part too is, you know, I gave a similar talk about racism in Candyman, and somebody asked a similar question. They said, well, what's the answer? I was like, well, stop being racist. You know, that these are simple answers, that they're very complicated cultural things, but the answer is really simple. Give women more power, and men need to stop being sexist and misogynist. Oh, what is the next step of my research? So one of the things that actually came out of this is I'm working on a chapter that deals with shark exploitation films. So not good shark films, right? Like Jaws. We're talking Deep Blue Sea and its sequels. We're talking about Shark Attack with Casper Van Dien that was only direct to video. And part of what the chapter does is it looks at those sort of, we'll build mutant sharks for science, right? To cure Alzheimer's or whatever it is. And it places that in the context of how that actually ends up being very anti-science rhetoric, and sort of how we view that in our current world, with people saying that you don't need to take vaccines for measles and you should drink bleach because it cures things, right? And so it's a similar close reading of those movies, placing them in their historical and political context. So that's what I'm working on now. Any other questions? Well, I told Dr. Reed that I would make sure I announce what our next couple of talks are. There is one tonight at 5 p.m. that's in the library. It's Dr. Ndengwu, who is from the University of Nigeria and is a Fulbright Scholar in residence at Albany State University. And she'll be talking about her current work, which is a book titled Women in the Yoruba Popular Traveling Theater of Nigeria, The Untold Story. And then on Thursday on Zoom, we have a talk from Christy Davenport called From Sundown to Swamp, Finding Limited Freedom in the Great Dismal Swamp. So that will end our talk for today. I apologize for people on Zoom. There is no cake for you. There is cake for everybody else, but thank you for coming. I appreciate it.